Hello, I'm Paul Innes, Professor of Shakespeare Studies. Welcome to my channel Shakespeare for All. Today we're going to be discussing Hamlet. This is one of 3 videos on the play dealing with characterisation, plot and context, and in this one we'll be having a look at the characters. Now, at the end of the video you'll find some study notes together with a list of keywords. I use the MIT online version of the text because it's easily accessible, together with the 3rd edition by the Arden, which you'll see is quite long because it's Hamlet. Any edition with supporting material like introduction, notes, appendices, that sort of thing is useful if you're studying the play. Effectively, we're going to look at Hamlet as a protagonist, the main character, Claudius as the antagonist, the opposition. We're also going to look at representations of women in the play by Gertrude and Ophelia. We'll spend a little bit of time on Horatio, Polonius and Laertes, but I don't want to talk about them in too much detail. We'll look at some textual samples to help understand the main characters and the way they work. There are other minor characters as well, but we're not going to bother too much about them. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to say thanks to my wife, Kathy, who's sitting over there. This is the latest play we've discussed on the channel, and it's time to say special thanks for all the effort. This is a family affair. Kathy does all the staging, filming, directing. In fact, it was her idea to pick up on the move to online teaching and use video material to set up a YouTube channel. So thank you for all your work and ideas. So we're going to start with Hamlet as the protagonist. 3 things you need to think about in terms of his character, his development, if you like. At the beginning of the play, he already knows something is wrong in Denmark before he sees the ghost. He's very astute. He realises something's wrong. The audience already knows this because they have seen the ghost, so it's quite striking that Hamlet is so highly intelligent. Now, as we move towards the middle of the play, especially Acts 2 and 3, he knows what he needs to do, but he needs to work out a way to arrange it, to manage it. He needs to achieve revenge, but he has to do so against the king. This is someone who's very powerful. So the cover of Madness, the antic disposition he puts on, is very important in this respect. Now, from Act 4 onwards, Hamlet seems to become much more of a decisive revenge figure. He acts very effectively by substituting the deaths of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern for his own, and engaging with Claudius in a duel of wits, a duel of politics. So what we're going to do is look at some textual samples. You'll find plenty of these. They're pretty much the classic ones. The first one we'll look at is on the screen for you. Don't worry, we're not going to read all of it because it's a long speech. This is from early in the play. He already knows something is rotten, okay? He hasn't seen the ghost yet, but he has seen his mother at court with his new father, his uncle, King Claudius, and he's not happy about this. He knows something doesn't feel right. So he talks about the fact that he is almost, he's not melodramatic, he's kind of melancholic. He says, "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw and resolve itself into a dew. Or that the everlasting had not fixed its canon against self-slaughter." Remember, this is set in medieval Catholic Denmark. Hamlet knows something's wrong. This guy Claudius has come between him and the throne. He doesn't know what to do. He's thinking about it too much. That's the classic interpretation. So he starts to think about suicide, but he can't do that either because he's a Catholic, not supposed to do that sort of thing. Then he goes political, actually, politic, that it should come to this, but 2 months dead. Nay, not so much, not 2. So excellent a king that was, to this. Hyperion, to a satyr, so loving to my mother that he might not beteem the winds of heaven visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth, must I remember? Why, she would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on. And yet within a month, let me not think on't, frailty thy name is woman. Now, basically, the reason I said this is political is because he's noticed, he knows deep down that it's very unusual for his mother to remarry so quickly after her husband's death, and he compares the 2 brothers most unfavourably in Claudius's respect. Okay, so what he's doing is he's being misogynistic. Frailty thy name is woman, as a classic revenge figure attitude. Misogyny is in there, but he's also saying My dad hasn't been dead that long. Now, part of the problem, of course, is that by marrying Gertrude before young Hamlet gets back from Germany, King Claudius gets the throne, okay? Because of the matrilineal system. There is a political point being made here. It's not just about Hamlet and whether or not he's contemplating suicide. There's much more going on. We'll skip towards the end of this section. She married, almost wicked speed, to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets. It is not, nor it cannot, come to good. But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. Why? Why does the heir to the throne have to hold his tongue? Because someone is now more powerful than he is. He suspects something's wrong, but he's going to keep his mouth shut till he figures out what's going on. So he's very astute, he's very politic, and he's not happy. And he still hasn't seen the ghost, remember. This happens before he actually encounters the ghost of his father. So we'll move on a little bit. This is the famous to be or not to be speech, which I had to talk about because it's Hamlet. You can't get away with it. By this point in the play, Act 3, Scene 1, he's planning, dissembling, and he's fully put on his antic disposition, which is perhaps shading over into real madness. So what he says is, to be or not to be, that's a question whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. So he's basically saying, what do I do? Do I keep suffering in this situation, or do I take arms? I'm stuck, I'm in a dilemma. It goes on, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. So he's being very careful. He's basically saying, whatever we do in this life is going to have an effect on our afterlife. We'll have to be very, very careful with what we do. And then he talks about the fact that he's burdened by this situation that he's in. Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. It's basically saying, I want to kill the guy, there are things I have to do, but there's the issue of the afterlife, there's the issue of the fact that we have to suffer. This is his dilemma, this is where he is when he's trying to find out what's going on with Claudius and what he can actually do about it. He's stuck at this point in the play. Now, as we move towards the end of the play, this one's from Act 4, Scene 4. He's just seen the Norwegian army pass across the stage and he comments on it. How stand I then, that have a father killed, a mother stained, excitements of my reason and my blood, and let all sleep? While to my shame I see the imminent death of 20,000 men, that for a fantasy and trick of fame go to their graves like beds, fight for a plot, whereon the numbers cannot try the cause, which is not tomb enough and continent to hide the slain. Oh, from this time forth my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. He's basically looked at this army trooping across the stage. Many of these men are going to die for no reason, a plot of land. And what am I doing about my situation? Right, that's it. From this time forth, my thoughts are going to be bloody. That's it. That's the point where he actually turns completely. So you can see the movement in the stages of the characterization. It's actually quite straightforward stuff. Now what we'll do is we'll look at Claudius as antagonist. And again, there's a three-part movement with Claudius. We're not necessarily going to look at all of them, but he starts off at the beginning of the play very much in power and in control. He then acknowledges his guilt in soliloquy. He doesn't know Hamlet's watching, but it does confirm that he has done what everyone thinks he's done, or everyone in the audience and Hamlet thinks he's done. And he also is very good at plotting and planning. So this is from the moment just prior to the first soliloquy we looked at with Hamlet. This is the king and state, right? Claudius enters with the whole court and Gertrude as his queen, Hamlet standing off to one side, already isolated, and this is the situation he was commenting on when we looked at him earlier. This is what Claudius does. This is a man in control, this is a king in power. Though yet of Hamlet our dear brother's death the memory be green, and that it us be fitted to bear our hearts in grief and our whole kingdom to be contracted in one brow of woe, yet so far hath discretion fought with nature, that we with wisest sorrow think on him, together with remembrance of ourselves. Therefore our sometime sister, now our queen, the imperial jointress to this warlike state, basically we've got married. There are three things going on here. He's using the royal plural, us meaning me, the king and state, but also us meaning the royal couple, me and the queen, and also us encompassing the whole court and therefore the whole country. This guy's a smooth operator. His use of rhetoric is very, very powerful. And he's basically saying, you know, although my brother's recently dead, and although I've just kind of married his wife, there are things that need doing, okay? And this is what he does. Now, it follows that you know young Fortinbras, holding a weak supposal of our worth, or thinking by our late dear brother's death, our state to be disjoint and out of frame, colleagued with the dream of his advantage, he hath not failed to pester us with message, importing the surrender of those lands lost by his father, with all bonds of law, to our most valiant brother. So much for him. It's basically saying, nah, young Fortinbras thinks I'm weak, he's wrong. And then he sends messengers off, he sends ambassadors off to Norway. This is a king doing state business. Right? This guy's very powerful, he's very shrewd, and he's in control. Now what we'll do next is we'll look at some sections of text. Again, these are on the screen, we won't read the whole lot. This is from the famous chapel scene, when he admits in prayer that he's murdered his brother. Oh, my offences rank, it smells to heaven. Now, that's a common Renaissance pun. Rank meaning high social rank, high social status. They don't really use the word class in the way we do, not in that period. But also, it stinks. Rank stinks, right? So he's done something he really shouldn't have done. It hath the primal eldest curse upon't, a brother's murder. Pray can I not, though inclination be sharp as will. My stronger guilt defeats my strong intent. So he's trying to pray, but he's got a problem. His conscience is bothering him because he knows he's done the wrong thing. And this is what he says, but oh, what form of prayer can serve my tongue? Forgive me my foul murder? That cannot be, since I am still possessed of those effects for which I did the murder. My crown, mine own ambition, and my queen. May one be pardoned and retain the offence. Now, Hamlet's in the background watching this, remember, and he decides not to kill him because the guy's praying. Right? Hamlet just doesn't want him dead. He wants him damned permanently. But this is where Claudius is admitting that he did the deed. Now, what you then get is a movement towards the representation of women in the play. This is something I want to talk about. This is Hamlet in the famous closet scene talking to his mother. Now, at this point in the scene, he's just murdered Polonius, the man who was going to be his father-in-law, the highest noble in the land, probably, after the royal family. And he basically has a real go at his mother for getting married so quickly. Look here, upon this picture, and on this, the counterfeit presentment of two brothers. And then he talks about his dad. He was glorious. And then he says, what about this guy Claudius? Ugh. You know, that's basically what he's saying. This was your husband. Look you now what follows. Here is your husband. Like a mildewed ear. That's a reference to the poison getting in the ear, by the way. Blasting his wholesome brother. Have you eyes? Could you on this fair mountain leave to feed and batten on this moor? Ha! Have you eyes? You cannot call it love. For at your age the heyday in the blood is tame. It's humble and waits upon the judgment. And what judgment would step from this to this? So he's hacked off, obviously, and he's basically having a right go at his mother for not mourning enough and marrying Claudius. Now, of course, part of the problem for young Hamlet is that by marrying Claudius, someone's come between him and the throne. In other words, Claudius. This isn't just a neutral statement of my dad was glorious and this guy's not. There's more to it than that. So the representation of the appetite of women is misogynistic, at least by young Hamlet. That's very common with revenge figures. The second figure, I want to talk about the second character, female character, is Ophelia. Now, the problem with Ophelia is, of course, that she goes insane. and she kills herself off stage. And this creates a problem for the presentation of her burial in accordance with Catholic rites, because this is medieval Denmark, it's a Catholic country. The priest says her obsequies have been as far enlarged as we have warranties. Her death was doubtful. Right, the problem with someone who's mad committing suicide is we don't know if she was in her right mind and killed herself, or if she killed herself because she was mad. We don't know. God is the only person who knows. So there's a real problem with the burial rites of a suicide victim in a situation like this. Laertes, a brother, says, "Must there no more be done?" Priest, "No more be done. We should profane the service of the dead to sing a requiem and such rest to her as to peace-parted souls." It's basically saying, you know, we can't do a full funeral for her in the way that we would do for people who've departed the world peacefully. There's a problem here. Laertes is not happy about this. "Lay her in the earth, and from her fair and unpolluted flesh may violets spring." It's quite a famous quotation as well. So what you have is different representations of women depending on where they are within what you might call a patriarchal structure. A queen with appetite, or a virgin who's gone completely insane and killed herself. So the representations of women in the play are not particularly pleasant a lot of the time. So now I want to say just a very short few words about the supporting cast. Pretty much talking about Horatio, Polonius and Laertes. All a very high social class, all of them, what we would call class status. They are all on familiar terms with the royal family of Denmark. Horatio is Hamlet's best friend and is a kind of choral commentator on the action, especially at the end of the play. Polonius is the king's main counsellor. He's probably something like the royal chamberlain, very, very powerful noble. He's the father of Ophelia, who is betrothed, presumably betrothed. It's not actually spelled out in those terms, but everybody expects her to marry Hamlet, Prince Hamlet. And her brother Laertes is a counterpoint to Hamlet. He's a much, much more brash, aggressive young man and forces the issue, which is why you end up with the catastrophe at the end of the play. So now we'll look at ways in which you can think about these characters in preparation for any assessments you might have to write on the play. As I said earlier, we'll concentrate on Hamlet and Claudius and Gertrude and Ophelia. So first of all, Hamlet as a main character. There are several things that need to be said here, because the character of Hamlet is usually assumed to be the moment where Shakespeare invents modern selfhood, modern subjectivity, the modern sense of inwardness, as he thinks about how to go about killing Claudius. His defining characteristic in this view is his constant procrastination, his inability to put into action the commands of his father. He thinks too much, and that then invents inward psychology. That's a very common critical position. However, and this point may pull against the previous one, the play itself, the modern play that we have, is a result of the reworkings of various contemporary versions of the play into a single, very long literary one through a long-term editing process that comes well after Shakespeare's death. On its own stage, the play was much shorter. So the figure of Prince Hamlet would have worked much more on its own stage like a traditional revenge figure, a stock character type, partly derived from the medieval vice persona. Now, even the modern version of Prince Hamlet bears marks of this much more historically precise figure. Specifically, the feigned madness that shades over into a possibly real insanity is very common in revenge tragedy. Very common indeed. It's one of the defining hallmarks of the subgenre, to be honest. You think of someone like Hieronymo in the Spanish tragedy, or Titus Andronicus. There are also associations with the underworld. That's where the vice figure is effectively Hamlet's ancestor. He's dealing with his father's ghost, or he's fighting with Laertes physically in Ophelia's grave in the trapdoor section of the stage. That location, on its own stage, was often associated with the underworld or hell, as in Dr. Faustus. Now, this precise contemporary Renaissance stage conception of the prince is worth mentioning in assignments because it shows that you're aware of the dramatic tradition. Not only is this a play, you're aware of what it's doing on its own stage as well. Now, what we have on the screen here, this is just to demonstrate just how common the image of a man holding a skull is in that period. This is a portrait by Frans Hals from roughly 1610, and it's a man dressed in black with a ruff holding a skull. So our image of Hamlet is not necessarily just a modern image, it belongs in its own period as well. Now, Claudius, moving on to Claudius' antagonist, he's a kind of Machiavel figure. Now, he doesn't hold the stage in the way that, say, Richard III does, or Iago and Othello, but he does get his own soliloquies, he does talk directly to the audience, and Claudius is a very shrewd political operator. The play begins with him having married his brother's widow so he can become king before the young prince gets back, who's the only other possible candidate. And we find out later in the chapel scene that he did indeed murder his brother. We were looking at that a few minutes ago. He tries to arrange Prince Hamlet's death by letters to England, and he does a deal with Ophelia's brother Laertes after he leads the people in what comes close to being a revolution. He also arranges all the poisons at the end of the play and loses the covert fight against young Hamlet almost by chance. Right? So this guy is very, very good at what he does. Now, we need to say something about Gertrude here, because as countless editors will tell you, medieval Denmark was a matrilinear society, which doesn't mean it was matriarchal. It doesn't mean the women were in control. It means that the lineage of the kings was derived from marriage or by being sons of a previous queen. You marry a queen or you're born to a queen. The man gains the throne, so it's not matriarchal, it's patriarchy, but he does so by being descended from a queen or, like I said, being married to one. That's exactly what Claudius has done. Presumably, it's what the previous old king Hamlet did as well. Now, of course, Prince Hamlet spends a great deal of his time attacking Gertrude, as we have seen, for marrying a man so inferior to his own father, but he's also well aware that by doing so, Claudius has attained the throne. So it's power politics as well. Now, of course, that's Hamlet's perspective. It's not exactly neutral. Misogyny is a common trait among revenge figures from other plays in the period, and of course some of the things Hamlet says about women, says directly to Ophelia, and as we've seen, says to his mother. Pretty unpleasant stuff. However, it is still possible he might be telling some of the truth. Claudius may not be as attractive as Hamlet's own father. Now, one reason for someone taking the throne is to establish a dynasty of their own. If Hamlet is still very young, he is described as a student, remember, then Gertrude may still be of childbearing age. If she married Hamlet's father when she was young, she may still be early to mid-30s, and Claudius may be older than her. So there's a dynastic progression issue here. Moving on to Ophelia, she's caught in a double bind, and it drives her to madness and suicide. She's pretty much Prince Hamlet's avowed fiancée, but she's ordered to be very wary of him by her brother and her father. Now, old Polonius has been told by Claudius, the king, to use Ophelia as a means of sounding Hamlet's motivations out. Find out what he's up to, spy on him, set your daughter on him, get her to report on him. Remember, this is the king telling a counsellor to get his daughter to spy on her fiancé, who's the heir to the throne. Okay? This is a really dangerous thing, and it drives her completely insane. As a shrewd political operator, Claudius knows very early on in the play that Hamlet might pose a threat to his own position on the throne. He keeps on talking about it as, a danger to the state. We can't let this mad prince run riot because, he's just killed Polonius, for example, while Claudius is thinking, and he says this to the audience, I think it's not love madness, I think there's something else going on here, and I need to be careful if I want to hang on to the throne. Right? So Claudius sees through Hamlet's deception and decides to do something about it. The problem is the stress of the fraught position in which this places Ophelia, together with Hamlet having to act out his antic disposition, is what drives her mad, and she kills herself off stage. So now we'll finish off with some keywords. There are a few of these that we've been using. One obviously is protagonist, meaning main character. Sometimes there are more than one, not in this play. The antagonist is the main opponent to the protagonist. In this play, the antic disposition matters. It's the phrase Hamlet himself uses to describe the disguise of madness he's going to adopt while trying to figure out how to kill Claudius. He's trying to keep Claudius off his back long enough to do something about the guy. Now, many people think it shades over to real madness, and this is held to be one of the characteristics that helps make Hamlet a modern man. However, as I said earlier, it's a very common aspect of revenge tragedy. It's in all of them. So it may be much more sensible to think of it as a characteristic of the revenge figure on his own stage. Now, the revenger is very common in the English Renaissance. Revenge plots are often marked by the need for the revenger to overcome various obstacles on the path to vengeance. These characters often have to feign madness. They have to dissemble. They have to deceive people as to their real intentions because they need to hide what they're really up to from the victims, because the victims are usually very, very powerful people, most often kings, like you have with Hamlet. Now, part of this acting of madness is, as many commentators will say, also a possible descent into real madness, at least temporarily, which perhaps explains the extreme violence that often results. Another element which I've mentioned is the language these figures use in this phase in the various plays, which includes some rather vile misogyny, such as that directed at his mother by Hamlet, and there are later stage figures like the malcontent that pick up on elements of this. I've mentioned soliloquies. These are speeches delivered directly to the audience by a character all alone on the stage. Iago's famous for it in Othello, Hamlet's famous for it in Hamlet. The Machiavel figure is the kind of stereotype or archetype that Claudius is picking up on. He doesn't hold the stage, as I said earlier, in the same way that Iago does or as Richard III does, but he's a very shrewd political operator and he tells the audience what he's doing in soliloquy. It's a stock character on the English Renaissance stage, derived from the writings of the Italian political theorist Niccolo Machiavelli. That's where the name comes from. I did mention matrilinear succession. Medieval Denmark had a matrilinear system. So basically, to become king, a man had to be either the son of a queen or the descendant of the queen, or to marry one. The only possible person to succeed King Hamlet on his death is young Prince Hamlet. But he is, rather conveniently for Claudius, a student in Germany and he's on his way back home. So what does Claudius do? Marries a queen, becomes king. So he knows exactly what he's doing. So to sum up, in this video we've discussed the figure of Hamlet himself in some detail. We've also looked at the characterisation of Claudius, Gertrude and Ophelia, and I hope this is helpful. Good luck with your studies, especially if you're having to write on the play in an exam or assessments. If you want to know more, there are videos on the plot and context for the play, so please remember to subscribe.